Hello. Today I am going to do another answer to a member's question. The member in question is Rory. He begins with a nice little observation which I'm going to repeat. He says, "I am much enjoying your talks on YouTube. Thank you for these. Paradoxically, since your cancellation," Rory says, "I seem to have had more, not less opportunity to listen to your history talks," which, Rory and everybody else, was precisely the idea of the YouTube channel. Right, his question is as follows. Do you think Sir Thomas More was in any way influenced by the similarity between his clash with Henry VIII and that between another Thomas and another Henry, ending with the martyrdom of Beckett? In other words, the clash between Thomas Beckett and Henry II, with the famous death, the famous murder in the cathedral, the king's repentance, and the triumphant assertion of the power of the church over the state. Could that have strengthened that whole extraordinary episode of Beckett, which becomes absolutely central to the self-perception of the English church? Beckett, for a long time, the greatest pilgrimage site in England and one of the greatest pilgrimage sites in Europe, of course, the centre of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and so on. Could that extraordinary incident have strengthened More's determination to defy Henry Tudor? Or, Rory concludes, do you think he was simply acting from principle? Well, the position with More is clear. We know absolutely More's sensitivity to the parallel between himself and Beckett. We know it very movingly from his last letter to his daughter Margaret Roper. He is condemned, he is awaiting execution. There is still the issue of the actual day of his death. And More expresses to his daughter, after this very tender series of farewells, expresses to his daughter the hope, the deep hope, passionate hope, that he will be executed on the 6th of July. And he explains that 6th of July, 1535. And this is because the day is associated with two, for him, important feast days, anniversaries. The first is the 6th of July is the eve of one of the feasts of St. Thomas Becket. It's the eve of his translatio, the translation of his relics into what becomes the site of his great tomb, that great centre of pilgrimage, which of course Henry would destroy, conspicuously determined to destroy, because Becket stood for everything that he opposed. It stood for the triumph of the church over the state. He was determined to impose kingship on church. So it's the eve of the feast of the translation, which takes place on the 7th of July. But it's also, it looks back to something else. It's the Eutas, it's the octave of the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, which takes place on the 29th of June. So there are two saints that are seen as vital by More at this key moment, this moment when he's about to meet his God. One is Becket. Why Becket? Exactly as Rory says, because Becket was the symbol of the defiance of the church against the power of the state. More believes that the church has finally to maintain its supremacy, its authenticity, its inviolability against the state. And then the second is St. Peter. Why the Eutas? Why the octave of the Feast of St. Peter? Because More finally comes to believe that the only guarantor of the continuity, of the unity, of the authenticity, of the Catholicity of the Church is the papacy, the institution built according to the medieval understanding of Christ's phrase, upon the rock of St. Peter. So these twin saints, clearly at the forefront of More's mind as he prepares for the agony of death. Thomas Becket and St. Peter as the representative, if you like, the prefigurer of the papal monarchy, the papal magisterium over the church. That's absolutely certain. We have More's own words for it. On the other hand, I think it would be hard to find a pattern of behaviour more different than that between Thomas More and Thomas Beckett. Beckett actively seeks out martyrdom. His conflict with Henry II is flamboyant. I mean, Beckett's an extraordinarily flamboyant character. There's a sort of passionate assertion, there's an actual quest for death. Beckett guarantees his own martyrdom by his behaviour. Thomas More behaves in completely an opposite fashion. More uses all his skills as a lawyer not to seek condemnation, not to seek martyrdom, but to try to avoid it. I don't think this is at all, in fact, it certainly is not because of cowardice. It is, I think, for two reasons. More, remember, is a layman. He's a married layman. He's somebody who has been involved actively for most of his career in business, the business of the City of London, the business of the Tudor state, the business of law, the business of the what we call the persecution of heresy, what he would call the holy repression of heresy. He has been involved in the world, which means he's sinned in the world. More is extraordinarily aware of his own sinfulness. To court martyrdom, well, the great lines in the play, great line in the play that T.S. Eliot wrote about the other Thomas Beckett, to do the right deed for the wrong reason, to seek martyrdom, that itself can be a sin of pride, that itself can be a sin of arrogance, that can be all the things that More doesn't believe in. So More is not questing for martyrdom, completely unlike Beckett. More takes a very different view. More is determined, clearly, never to acknowledge the king as supreme head of the church. That is the breaking point between Henry and More. And remember, we've talked about the relationship between Henry VIII and More a lot. It's not just a relationship of king and counsellor, however intimate. It's not just a relationship that begins when they're adults. They've known each other for so long. Henry knew More as a boy. As I've been trying to argue in earlier videos, More is one of the key influences on Henry's, for reasons we do not fully understand. He's one of the key influences on Henry's upbringing. He's responsible for the choice of his second principal tutor, the man called Holt, who had been responsible for inculcating Henry into the fine Erasmian Latin. He's an intimate of somebody else who is so closely associated and so much an observer of the early Henry, of Erasmus, and especially of the man who was Henry's companion of studies, the great shaper of this whole pattern of youthful experience, not simply in the classroom but at court, on the tilt yard, everywhere, and Lord Mountjoy and William Blount, Lord Mountjoy. So More is at the centre, had been at the centre of Henry's life. He'd been quasi-family, and I think both parties find the rupture extraordinarily brutal. They react in very different ways. Henry, if somebody puts a loyalty to anything above him, love turns to hatred, I think, I'm sure. With More, on the other hand, there's that sense of, I think, lingering regret. Remember, More had actually hailed Henry at the moment of his accession, way back in 1509, as the great liberator king after the tyranny, the ruthless exactions of his father. More, I think, never forgets that. But break, indeed he does. It comes dramatically. The moment the clerical parliament, the moment the convocation of Canterbury in 1532 formally recognises Henry's claim to be supreme head of the church without condition, without the earlier conditions which had been imposed largely by More's friend John Fisher, insofar as the law of God allows, which of course made the title completely redundant. The moment Henry is declared and is accepted without condition as supreme head of the church, More resigns his office as Lord Chancellor. He knows he can conscientiously, that word that Rory, the question of conscience, that word that Rory mentions, he can conscientiously no longer hold office under the king who requires that. But more equally, makes no attempt, I think, to persuade others at all. He makes no attempt to turn his position into one of propaganda. He adopts no public position on the matter at all, apart from silence. He refuses to take the oaths. Well, he says he will actually take the oath to the Boleyn marriage. He passionately disapproves of it, but as far as he is concerned, who is Queen of England, the consequences for the English succession, these are a matter which the state, which the kingdom, which the Parliament of the kingdom can properly determine. But for More, the state, the kingdom, the king, the Parliament cannot determine who is head of the church. However, Rory, More never ever formally says that. Formally to say that, from the act of supremacy, from the act of treason and so on, it actually does become treason to assert that. More never deliberately condemns himself out of his own mouth. The condemnation that is produced at his trial in 1535 is by the twisting of words, the famous the twisting of words. We'll talk about the trial separately. We won't do it here. The famous twisting of the words that leads the jury finally to convict him. And it's only at that moment, once More has actually been convicted, if we believe the account of his trial by William Roper, that's the husband, that's More's son-in-law, the husband of Margaret. At that point, once he is a dead man, only then does More speak out. And what he does is something very remarkable. He challenges the verdict. At that point in law, and remember, More is a very great lawyer, you were entitled, after you had been condemned, to appeal to the court, to traverse the verdict. You could explain why the law was wrong. And of course, More, as the greatest lawyer of the day, does so in brilliant terms. He explains to the court that the decision of Parliament, that the king was head of the church, was one which Parliament simply could not take. And he explains it in the following fashion. He, remember, had begun his career within the City of London. He'd been sheriff within the City of London and an important legal and administrative officer within the city. He's clearly reflecting that experience in what he says to the court. He says that the Parliament of England could no more determine that the king was head of the church than the City of London could take a decision that bound the whole of England, because the Parliament of England was subordinate. It was only a part. It was only, if you like, he uses effectively the term, a parochial council. The real council, the body of consent, was the consent of the whole of Christendom. It was a general council of the church. Only a general council of the church could determine whether the king or the pope was the head of the church. The part could not determine for the whole. And it's that passionate belief of More. Of course, he explains it. The Chancellor Audley, who is presiding over the tribunal, is deeply concerned. He can't answer More. He turns to the Lord Chief Justice who is present. And the Lord Chief Justice, Moores, produced this elaborate argument that this is beyond, it's ultra vires, it's beyond the competence of Parliament, because Parliament is merely one part of, England is just one part of Christendom, and the English Parliament is just an assembly for that subordinate part of Christendom, and the part cannot bind the whole. How does the Lord Chief Justice deal with it? Well, he does so by a piece of absolutely classic English legal positivism. He says, if it's an act of Parliament, it's good enough. The classic position of English common law, that there is nothing that an act of Parliament cannot do, even make the king supreme head of the church. So that, if you like, is more finished. But it's also fundamentally more begun. Because remember, this position of the vital importance of the Pope as head of the church is not one that More had passionately held for most of his life. And it's again very important to understand that More had another Thomas, another St. Thomas, that I think he was much more attached to than Beckett. And that other St. Thomas is, of course, Doubting Thomas. It's St. Thomas, the apostle, who doubts. And More is devoted to the idea of that St. Thomas. He is aware of doubt. He is aware of the uncertainty of faith. He is aware of the insecurity of the Christian against the inscrutable judicial majesty of God. So More, and again, More had had direct experience of this and direct experience of managing Henry through all of this. Because remember, there's a peculiar way, not a peculiar way, there's a direct way in which Henry and More actually reverse position on this. Way back, well, not all that way back, where in 1535, only 14 years before, in 1521, in the immediate aftermath of the great performance of Luther at the Diet of Worms, Henry decides, after receiving a report from More's close friend, who had been Henry's ambassador at the Diet of Worms, Cuthbert Tunstall, after receiving a report from Cuthbert Tunstall as to the effect of Luther's latest book, The Babylonian Captivity, and its attack on the doctrine of the seven sacraments and the reduction of them really just to baptism and to the Mass, Henry decides to launch that fundamental attack on Luther, the assertion of the seven sacraments, and equally the assertion of the papal supremacy over the Church, which Luther, of course, had fundamentally challenged from 1517 onwards. And it is More at this point, who is acting as kind of Henry's editor, I imagine, yes, acting very much as editor come senior researcher in bringing together Henry's text. I think Henry does write the bulk of the Assertio, but it's More who helps to organise it, to put it together, working again, I'm sure, with John Fisher, to turn the text into an actual quite impressive assertion of the case. But More warns Henry. She goes back to Rory, to Beckett and to Henry II. He says, is it really very sensible for a king of England to be making such a passionate assertion of the unchallenged papal supremacy over the Church? I mean, after all, he sort of says, do remember one of your predecessors, who was also called Henry, did have a problem with the Church, and, it was Beckett. So what happens is, in that intervening 14 years, Henry persuades himself absolutely that he'd been wrong in 1521, that he'd been wrong, even more wrong, at the beginning of his reign in 1513, when he'd actually waged a war in the name of the papal monarchy on behalf of Julius II, his campaign against France in 1513. Astonishingly, he is a papal captain. The Pope had condemned Henry's enemy, Louis XII of France, because Louis XII, believe it or not, was divorced. Oh, heaven's sake. And Louis XII had also assaulted the papal armies in Bologna, in Italy, and so on. And indeed had summoned his isn't it wonderful, had summoned a schismatic council of the church to threaten to dethrone Pope Julius. So Henry was acting as a papal captain against this wicked, heretical, schismatic king of France who'd got divorced. That's the young Henry of 1513. And of course, he has to explain later on, after 1532, after he'd persuaded himself and been persuaded by the extraordinary accumulation of texts from 1529 onwards, that he really was the head of the church. He had to explain these earlier positions because, well, he said, I was young and I was the victim, effectively, of persuasion and lies by the bishops. More, on the other hand, embarks on completely the opposite journey. Remember, the younger More, closely associated with Erasmus, was profoundly sceptical of the papacy. After all, the Pope was that Pope, Julius II, named after Julius Caesar, for heaven's sake. His predecessor was Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, named after Alexander the Great. These were popes who poisoned, these were popes who waged war, these were popes who consciously draped themselves in robes of a Roman emperor. These were popes who, Erasmus says in the famous Julius Exclusus, were anti-Christian, and More and Erasmus pour the weight of satire, of contempt, of scepticism. That's the beginning of More's journey. In the name, of course, of More and Erasmus, of a return to a fundamental and honest Christianity, a Christianity that reflects the life, the teaching, the actual words of Jesus in the Gospel of the Old Testament, which Thomas More, Erasmus, very much aided by Cuthbert Tunstall, really put centre stage with his new edition of the Greek New Testament, the edition published in 1516 with a new and radical Latin translation, to which Erasmus gives that extraordinary, striking name, the Novum Instrumentum, the new instrument. I've talked about that a lot in the video that I did on Thomas Lineker, who with his work on medicine and the rediscovery and publication of the texts of Galen is doing something very similar, or trying to do something very similar with medicine. So More is associated with all of that. What is it that brings about the change? Well, it is precisely More's experience of trying to enforce uniformity, trying to resist the Lutheran heresy. In that period from 1521 onwards, More not only acts as Henry's factotum, as Henry's editor and senior researcher in the production of the text of the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, he also, he clearly acts as Minister of Police against the beginnings of the Lutheran heresy, the importation of Lutheran books, the influence of the German merchants of the Steel Yard, the great trading centre, the Hansa trading centre on the banks of the Thames, which was one of the great centres of the diffusion, for obvious reasons. German books in German, got contacts across the North Sea to the ports on the North Sea and the Baltic, that it acts as one of the great centres for the importation of Lutheran books and Lutheran ideas. And More is in charge, at the centre of the attempted repression of all of this. And it is an awareness of what heresy, what large-scale heresy means, which converts Thomas More to the view that Luther and his works, and Tyndale, the native follower, William Tyndale, Luther's native follower in England, that their works have to be resisted absolutely, because he sees that what heresy will do, and here More is a prophet. He sees that the rejection of papal authority, the assertion of that individualistic interpretation of the Bible, will lead to a rupture. It will lead to a fragmentation of Christianity and a tearing apart of the body of the church splitting into 1,000 fragments, which of course is in fact exactly what happens. So More finally becomes converted to the need, to the absolute, the irresistible need of a papal supremacy over the church, to the point at which he is actually prepared, finally, though postponing it as long as possible, to die for it. This, as I've said, is completely, this whole sort of trajectory, this thoughtfulness, this debate with himself, is completely unlike Beckett. It's completely unlike the passionate assertion, the flamboyance, the display, put it more simply, the arrogance of Beckett. More is not arrogant in this. Absolutely the opposite. Now, here again, I think it's important to ask another question. How do More's contemporaries, those most closely associated with him, behave in this period, this extraordinary period, when English polity, Henry VIII himself, turns on a pin's head on the matter of religion on either side of the 1st of January 1527, which, as I've argued and I will argue, and I'll present the arguments here quite fully, on that day is the day that Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn agree that they will marry. And round that day, the entire religious policy of Henry VIII's reign turns. Up to that moment, Henry is the great advocate of the papal supremacy. He is the great advocate of orthodoxy. He is the great resistor of heresy. From that point onwards, Henry begins on that long journey that will take him first to the supremacy and then to that series of increasing bitings away of the structure of the Church of the Middle Ages, of which he had been that great and passionate defender. How, for instance, does John Fisher, the man who had acted very much as coadjutor with Thomas More in that campaign of the 1520s against heresy, how does he react? Fisher was the outstanding English theologian. He is the Bishop of Rochester. He had been the great preacher against heresy. So Wolsey, from 1521, Wolsey does the flamboyant stuff as papal legate. Thomas More does the dirty as a kind of minister of police, and Fisher acts as the ideologue and the great preacher of sermons. How does Fisher react at that great moment of challenge of 1527? Well, how Fisher reacts is dramatically different from More. More, remember, as late as 1529, the fall of Wolsey, is prepared to assume the office of Lord Chancellor. He specifically negotiates with Henry. He says, I'm not going to have anything to do with the divorce, but I believe, he says, you, Henry, still hate heresy. You still believe in the papal supremacy. I will work to continue my task of suppressing heresy, of keeping England within the universal church and whatever. Fisher, totally the opposite. Fisher is the first to be consulted on the actual theology, the first, as it were, to be formally consulted. Henry, of course, the moment he and Anne Boleyn have decided that they really do want to marry, Henry immediately sets the secret machinery of a divorce, of a declaration of nullity, which is what it really amounts to, in motion. But there is the formal consultation of Fisher as the preeminent theologian. Fisher immediately comes out against Henry. That he sees the issue. He denies that the king has got a case, that the papal dispensation for his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was wrong. That's to say, because Catherine had been married before to Arthur. He argues that the Pope has got absolute full right to make that dispensation. He also argues that the case that Henry finds himself in, that Arthur had been childless, and that there'd also been a question about whether or not the marriage had been consummated, means that there actually wasn't all that much to be dispensed anyway, and that the Pope was fully right to give the dispensation, and therefore Henry was irretrievably, indissolubly married to Catherine. And from that point onwards, Fisher is perfectly clear, as Henry does everything to challenge that position. He is quite clear that Henry must be resisted, and resisted by, if need be, and he gets to this position very quickly, by overtly political means. See, I think we get, and I'm going to talk about Fisher much more later on, I think we get Fisher absolutely wrong. Traditionally, he's read backwards. He's read backwards from his martyrdom, you know, and there is that wonderful Holbein drawing of him with the haggard face, you know, that sense of a body of mere flesh and bone, this deeply holy man, which clearly he was. But what we forget, of course, is what Fisher had been. Fisher had been the star, he'd been the star academic politician at Cambridge. He was the most successful vice-chancellor. He is the man, of course, who becomes the intimate of the great. He becomes confessor to Lady Margaret Beaufort. Lady Margaret Beaufort submits herself to Fisher in a way that she does to no other human being, including, I think, her son. And Fisher enjoys this extraordinary access to political power. And it is Fisher, through his association with Lady Margaret Beaufort as her confessor, and also his friendship with Henry VII's last confessor, a man called Stephen Barron. You have the two royal confessors working together to secure enormous funding for the church at Windsor, at Westminster Abbey, and more particularly at Cambridge. It is undoubtedly Fisher that secures the gigantic sums from Henry VII, which complete the building of King's College Chapel in record time. So Fisher is, yes, he's holy, yes, he's highly learned, but he is a brilliant, both academic and real politician. And I would argue something else, and we'll have an entire video, at least one on this. It is Fisher and it is Stephen Barron, the two of them as the two royal confessors, who, it is clear, manage the deathbed of Henry VII, and I would argue manage the deathbed of Henry VII so that Epsom and Dudley are destroyed. So you get Fisher as an ecclesiastical politician making sure that a pair of lawyers, a pair of lawyer financiers who have launched a serious attack upon the wealth and the power of the church, and Fisher would argue, of course, have risked the soul of the king because they have introduced him to avarice, to the oppression of the poor, and so on and so forth. He brings them down. He, I think, without a shadow of doubt, willed their deaths, enabled their deaths. Fisher has that certainty, that iron certainty, which More, the debater, the doubtful, the man who attached so much importance to St. Thomas the Doubter, didn't. There is that clarity. So Fisher is much, much nearer, in other words, to Beckett. He's much nearer in the passion, the openness, the force of his opposition to Henry, and his willingness to recruit others, and his willingness to, I'm going to say dabble, actually much more than that, his willingness to commit actual treason, to associate himself with domestic resistance and to invoke foreign powers. That's essentially to invoke the Habsburgs against Henry. So whereas we have Thomas More, despite the fact that he's called Thomas, very, very remote from the behaviour of Beckett, we have Fisher, well, actually very close to the behaviour of Beckett. Finally, there's a third figure, the figure of William Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He, of course, is the person who acts as the kind of, what's the word I want, the kind of tortoise-like figure. His slowness in dying, his determination to hang on, is finally the great obstacle to Henry moving rapidly, coming up with any complete solution to the divorce at all, because it's only once Warham dies in 1532 that Henry can change Archbishops of Canterbury, can manoeuvre Thomas Cranmer into the position, and then Cranmer, of course, moves way forward swiftly with the Boleyn marriage and everything else. But Warham he'd been a kind of sleeper. Once again, he's often condemned. Jack Scarisbrick writes of him that he should have been a Beckett. There is, in fact, a speech that is written by Warham, in which is a speech that would have been written to have been delivered in Parliament, in which he does take the line of Beckett in saying the king has gone too far, the supremacy is wrong and wicked, we must resist, I know that my only fate is martyrdom. But he never delivers that speech. Are we to condemn him? Obviously. Some would. A serious, passionate Catholic like Jack Scarisbrick would. The rest of us, I think we can see the difficulty. Warham was a passionate believer in the church as it stood. He's a princely and learned and serious Archbishop of Canterbury. But he's also, of course, the king's servant. There is too little, I think, interpreted Harold's Parliament role. It's for the Parliament of 1512, and of course the principal figure, one of the principal figures in that, is Archbishop Warham as Chancellor, and he's fully vested and robed, with mitre and magnificent cope and all the rest of it. But when you actually look at it, you see on the shoulders here are the royal arms of England. So he's not simply the head of the English Church. I mean, the head of the English Church is wrong. He's not simply the primate of all England. He is also the king's servant. And it is this balance, this what is the relationship between being a king's servant and a royal servant. So a king's servant, a royal servant, and God's servant, and God's subject. King's subject and God's subject. It is the relationship of those two positions that everybody at this time, this is the terrible test, the test of fire and the axe that is imposed on the whole English elite, arguably on everybody in England by the events of the reign of Henry VIII. How do you balance those two things? Loyalty to the king, loyalty to God, duty to the king, duty to God. For Fisher, it's easy. He's God's. For Wolsey, it had been easy. He was the king's. For Moore, there is that exquisite balance that he again summarises in precisely these terms of service. He was the king's good servant, but finally, God's first. Again, so different from Beckett, who, once he'd ceased to be the servant of Henry II, and once he'd become the primate of the church, he is simply the church, nothing else. For Moore, there is always that straddling between politics and religion, between royal service and his absolute sense of Christian duty, his Catholic duty. And it's that straddling, it's precisely that lack of certainty which makes Moore so interesting and finally, I think, so great. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.